Thank you for being here and for hanging in here for the last session. It's been a lot of intense, long, lengthy, and very interesting presentations so far. I hope that this will be able to link on to some of the other themes that we've been in. It seems I'm able to see a lot of connections here. I'm going to be talking about some work that we've been doing over the past 4 years. Rolf and I are going to share the presentation. I'm going to take the first part and talk a little bit about the first project that we've done and some of the work that findings that we have from the first study. And then I'm going to hand it over to Rolf, who's going to present our most recent work with this theme, Embodied Interpretation, Gestures, Social Interaction, and Meaning Making. So I don't know if everybody else is aware or has noticed how much posing and physical interaction in art museums has been in the wind lately. It's maybe we're just very hypersensitive to it, but it seems there's an awful lot going on. And not least, this can be linked to the use of mobile phones and with cameras, and the people are using and interacting in gallery spaces in totally different ways than previously. And from there, you have not only selfies, but you have posing, interacting with art in all sorts of new ways. This is a little bit of a smorgasbord from some of the links that I've been collecting. We have Posing at the Louvre, which is its own blog, where you see that the visitors are staging an artwork themselves. They're collaborating on staging this series of sculptures. You have on the right, you have upper right, you have from the new, fairly new now, installation still at the Gallery 1 in the Cleveland Museum of Art. And if anyone hasn't been or has the chance, I really recommend it. It's the most pedagogically sound use of new technologies and interactives in gallery spaces that I've seen, very reflective and full of great content and thinking about how we interact with technologies in museums and use our bodies, not least. On the bottom is an article, I think, was it from New York Times? I'm not sure. Yeah, so this is the Getty Museum of Art. This is a new tour that they have. That's right, it was a friend of yours who took this tour. A new tour that they have where there's not necessarily technologies involved, but it involves posing and interacting with artworks in different ways using body. So it's gotten great reviews as a formidlings educational tour. So one of the focuses for the research project called Contact that ended in 2013 was this idea that what kinds of, based on all of the good practices and work that educators do in museums, how can these be developed in pedagogically interesting ways with new technologies, and particularly in gallery spaces? And this is a huge problem, right? Because I'm not talking here just necessarily about mobile devices, but other ways of interacting with art and that may be disturbing, or the idea of how do you integrate technologies into gallery spaces with authentic works of art. This is a huge theme. And they were building a lot of new museums, not least for the National Museum here. And this is an important topic, I think, to be raised about how are spaces, and as we move through spaces and technologies and interacting with artworks, how can we be thinking about those in ways that offer new interpretive opportunities? So I'm going to show, I'm not going to talk about the Contact project, but I'm going to show just a little clip that gives a little feel of the project. It had 3 partners. We had one with the Kulturdepartement's National Museum. We had very good collaboration with the National Museum for the past 4 or 5 years. It had another partner with the University Museum, the Cultural History Museum, looking at archaeology and ways of using technology from excavation sites. And it had a third kind of set of partners of organizations that were more independently organized, so not from large institutional settings. So I'm just going to play this first. Be careful with the sound. This is from the National Museum experiment room that we did called In Monk's World. And one of the methods that we used in this contact project was exploring different ways of collaborative design and participatory design with the museum and institutional partners on board and students and users as well. This was in connection with the cultural rucksack, Scenekunstbruk, multi-touch table application linked to learning about architecture. And this was another application we developed for the Monk Room we're going to talk more about. Here the soundtrack's a little warped. Compressed files. Okay, it's speeding up. That's interesting. This is an application, one of the commercial products from the product called VisiTracker, looking at user participation and how do we track visitors, their movements, their interactions in different gallery spaces and visualizing these. So it's just a little bit of a taste give a little bit of a feel for what we have done in the Contact project. So from this first project that we did with the posing that you saw in the film, where visitors are invited to assume the pose of Munch in one of his self-portraits. Munch, as most of you probably know, was a pioneer in using photography in his work. And yeah, there's a lot of claims about who was the first artist to do a selfie, but we have pretty good grounds that we're making claims that Munch was one of the first. And we got interested in this, what was happening with the posing interactions, because the public, the visitors became a very social activity, even though it was initially designed as, you know, the idea of doing a self-portrait as one person, became a very kind of collaborative activity. And in Rolf's work with this data that we've collected, started to really look more closely at what posing and drawing on gesture research. And there's this lovely quote that I think for a lot of the artists in the audience and that are working both with art and pedagogy, this notion that the art of seeing and the art of showing are interdependent, this visual idea of this idea of the visual and how we bring to it an understanding of, for example, in traditional works of art or figurative works of art, we understand what emotion or what a story is being told. That artists make visible psychological representations of human action or possible actions, and that as human beings, we can anticipate and complete this action by recognizing the character's experiences and intentions. And from a meaning-making perspective, I mean, we come from the Department of Education. I probably didn't even mention that, and I don't have a logo on our Prezi either. But from the University of Oslo, we're at the Department of Education. And so we're interested in kind of in learning and the sociocultural perspectives on meaning-making. And it builds on Vygotsky and some very kind of classic understandings of developmental psychology. But the idea is that gestures are not only a social a way of kind of a communicative resource and a social interaction, but they're also a part of an internalization and human development aspect. So Vygotsky has written quite a bit on this, and so the idea here is just that the meaning making is not just through gesture, has an internalization as well as an externalization process. So in the first study that Rolf worked on particularly was looking at posing as a gesture. So what is it that you're doing when you're posing? And there was an initial kind of modeling based on observations of all of the interactions at this station that you saw in the video, of kind of a sequence or a cycle of posing and the kind of work that was going on in a posing gesture. And through the Contact Project and our collaboration with the National Museum, this was picked up in practice on a call, and her team and the Palmyre, which workshop activity that was both in museums, it traveled, it's been used in different kinds of contexts, builds on this idea that the students were invited to pose as a monk, and then that picture became the point of departure for creative work using a paint application on iPads. They worked in groups, even though there was one iPad per group, and then they produced, through this paint application, their own kind of rendering and interpretation. So we presented together, actually, which I think is really nice, at the Museums and the Web conference. Oh, that can't be right. It was last year, wasn't it? Was it this year already? Wow. Okay, so we presented at the Museums and the Web conference this research that both builds on Rolf's research with posing and on how it's been picked up and applied in practice. Yeah, so at this point, I'm going to turn over to Rolf, and he's going to talk about this notion that he's developed called embodied interpretation, and show how we've built from this posing research and the perspectives, the theoretical and empirical findings that we've done, and how it's been applied to this most recent article that we're collaborating on. Am I gonna?
Yeah, hello. So I want to begin talking about this concept of embodied interpretation by talking about the trajectory where this concept emerged, because I think it's quite interesting. The clip that you saw at the beginning of this interactive project room, that was kind of the starting point to look at how different ways visitors could engage physically with different aspects of technology, specifically when they're working with Munch's work. And that posing station was really popular, and so looking more closely at that posing station led to this first study. It wasn't until after that we looked at other data that we had collected from visitors around the permanent collection, the main gallery, that posing behaviors were also a natural part of what visitors were doing when they interacted with art. So starting with the technology was kind of an impetus for looking at some of these, well, in posing in particular, how posing emerged as a way of physically engaging with these interpretive processes. So then that was one gestural form, I guess. And then after that, we stepped back, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, a more general concept of embodied interpretation, which includes posing, but also a lot of different forms of gesture and movement and positioning. So we have this working definition where gesture, movement, and bodily action, like language, become actualized as resources for visitors' interpretive and meaning-making processes in museums. So this is kind of drawing on at least two different areas of research. You have the sociocultural approaches to meaning-making with art, on the one hand, which is looking at these dialogic processes, people's conversations, social interactions with each other and with resources. And then we're also pulling in field in embodied studies of embodied interaction and gesture research. So I can give you a very quick background on some of the ways the gesture and body are used. There's one idea, it's called environmentally coupled gestures. That's this idea that to understand the meaning of a particular gesture, you have to look at the things around the people and the context. McNeil, in a classic study, identifies 4 kinds of gesture that I won't get into. So that's kind of the entryway into this idea of embodied interpretation. So the study took place here. This, if you recognize, this is the second floor of the National Museum. I'm going to share with you 3 episodes, and you can see episodes 1, 2, and 3. Those are the locations in the rooms where they occurred. Episode 3 was in this interactive project room that we've spoken about, and episodes 1 and 2 are in the main gallery. This study uses interaction analysis, so we filmed, first we recruited groups of teenage visitors specifically in an out-of-school context. We wanted to minimize sort of many of the students had been to the museum before with a class experience, and we wanted to look at how they approach these interactions with art without the guidance of a teacher or curator. So we recruited small groups of visitors, filmed them. Some of them wore glasses that had a camera on them to record their whole visit through the museum, and they were given very little instruction. It was just to pretend you're on a normal visit and go through the museum as you would, and the only stipulation was that they had to go to this interactive project room at some point on their visit. But other than that, we stepped back and watched what emerged. So we're really looking at how these visitors make meaning on their own, the resources that they take advantage of, the experiences that they make relevant, and in particular, how they use their bodies and gestures and language to make meaning with these works. So the first episode was with the thinker. And if you can see, there is a square in the lower right. That is the view from the glasses that this girl is wearing here. And I'm gonna play. There's clips are about 1 minute. I'm gonna play it through once, and then I'm gonna play it again and sort of talk over a few of the key things that I'd like to point out.
But maybe he had not yet. I know this guy.
Oh, the thinker.
Yeah, I love him. I saw this in Copenhagen, I saw.
Brown.
So cool.
Like his hair is like sticking out. It doesn't look like he's thinking as much as it looks like he.
Look at his hands. No. He's definitely thinking. He has a big choice to make.
If I would have been thinking, my chin would have been higher up. Not like.
But that's why maybe he's sad. It's like, oh no, I have to give up everything.
Yeah, so it's a short interaction, but I think it's really exciting, and there's a lot happening. They're moving and gesturing in a variety of ways, so I'd just like to play it again, muted, and point some of these things out. So they approach the work, and they recognize it. The one girl has seen a different version of it before. And right at the beginning, you see them point to the label and notice that it's made out of bronze. This leads to this sort of material. They don't say much, but they're looking at they next look at the detail of the hair, and clearly the bronze material evokes some meaning for them about what is, about what is worth paying attention to and what the meaning of the work is. They then start viewing the work from different angles. You see them split up as they rotate around. So they're shifting their orientation of the sculpture is shifting as they move around the work, and they're looking for new things. And then something really interesting, this idea that, this idea that he's not really thinking, or what does thinking look like? This emerges as a question for them. And it's kind of it's a question that they ask, but then it guides the rest of their interaction. So they're standing on opposite sides of the sculpture, but then they rotate around to be on the same side to look at the sculpture in profile. They're looking at details. She points out that his chin, if she were thinking, his chin would be in a different position. And then she poses. She recreates the pose of what she thinks thinking should look like, if she were Rodin, I guess. So within this very, it's about a minute or so, They've looked at the material aspects of the bronze sculpture. They've moved around it, viewing it from different angles. They pick up on this one detail and ask this question about what thinking should look like, and then they begin to depict it themselves, and this creates this discussion for them. And they don't agree, but I think that's good. It gets them to elaborate on their interpretations. And then they move on. So the next episode is with it was the painting. It's Christian II signing the death warrant of Torben Knox. It's also, I believe it's still on display here. And this is with 3 visitors. I forget who's wearing, and I forget who's wearing the glasses, but you can see the first-person view here on the lower left. I'll play it.
Isn't he? Oh, he looks a lot like that person. Yeah, I know.
They're pictures of the same thing, by the same guy.
So he's probably the same person. I think they're looking at him.
Well, his eyes aren't looking in the same place. Unless there's somebody right about here. Somebody really close to his face. And then if you look at his eyes, he's clearly looking at exactly the same thing. There's somebody standing right about here.
He's signing the death warrant.
And then that old lady, her eyes are also...
Oh, maybe they're like looking at death or something, because it says he's like signing the death warrant.
Warrant of Torben Knox. Which leads me to speculate that Torben Knox would be standing right about here. Because 1, 2, 3, oh, and those people over there. 4, they all line up to about here. Somebody right in front of the throne.
Yeah, so it's funny and interesting for a lot of reasons. I think this isn't something that we were looking at specifically, but the social relationships between a group of friends visiting also becomes a really interesting thing to look at. In this group, the 2 girls are moving away from him and then coming back together, and he clearly has a lot of art knowledge that he's trying to communicate, and they're both listening sometimes, but also trying to develop their own interpretations. So I'll let it display a few of the things. So the interaction begins. There's a study for the work that sits on the left, and they notice that this relationship between the 2, that they're similar. And the camera glasses on the lower left make its comparison really obvious. You can see the head shift back and forth. And that sort of is their entryway into the work. And then one of them notices that the gaze of the figures, of the people in the painting, are all looking the same way. So that question, in the previous episode, this question of what does thinking look like, or it doesn't look like he's thinking, guided their interpretation. Here it begins as what is they looking at, which more broadly is what is happening in this scene. So that leads them to this minute or so interpretation. And that's where it gets really interesting when you start to look at the way they're using their bodies. So the initial comparison took place. They were situated in between the 2 paintings. As then they shift their focus, they move in front of this other large work, which maybe is obvious that the work that you're in front of is the one you're interacting with, but they're also shifting between the label, which is all the way on the right side, so when they go reference that, they move their bodies, and then when they step back, the boy here is using his hands to do many things. First, he's directing attention by pointing to the figures that he's referring to. And then he begins to trace their gaze to extend the scene from the painting out into the space in front to figure out where everyone is looking. So the space in front of the work is this really important interactive zone where their interpretations are being built. They're extending the scene, and sort of he goes and stands where he believes the people are looking, and he's building this larger scene. And then they turn back to the label for more information. So they notice that it's about this death warrant, and then they speculate on whose death warrant is being signed, and perhaps that's the person that's standing out front here. So I think what's really interesting here, it's when you compare it to the sculpture, intuitively you might suspect that, well, a sculpture situated in the middle of the space affords these kind of movements around more readily. But here, there's a lot of movement and gesturing that's happening in this sort of stage-like space in front of this work. Yeah, so I'm going to go to one more episode. This was the interactive project room that you had seen a few short clips from. I'm going to show just an interaction at one station, which is this multi-touch table all the way on the left-hand side here. The activity here was to arrange versions of Munch's different versions of the screams, sketches, paintings, lithographs, in a sequence either chronologically or according to the way that those images matched with the text that Munch had written, which images most strongly represented that text. And they have to agree. The important feature to pay attention to is that for them to make their sequence, they have to agree with each other before they can proceed. So the idea here was to sort of force them to elaborate on their own thinking and maybe generate a disagreement that would force them to get a conversation going. Oh, and then, yes, sorry. And then there's also, the text is, the surface is not only the multi-touch table, there's a screen that's hanging on the wall behind that has additional text in context with it.
There's a confirm button in the background.
Oh. This one?
This one.
No.
It's more sad.
No, but this one is like his
Look,
and his blood.
Sunset.
Yeah, that's sunset, that's blood.
Oh, it says sunset.
No. No. What is right?
Maybe it was just us. But that was based on.
So for this particular question, there wasn't a right answer. It was just arranging the sequence as they saw. Play it one more time. But again, so here, because this is a touch table, they are sort of fixed. Their feet are fixed to be able to interact with the table. But they're still using their hands and bodies in interesting ways to negotiate this task. Yeah. So the point where they disagree, that sort of is the entryway. So if you think back to the first two episodes that I showed, these questions sort of emerge naturally. What does thinking look like? What are they looking at? What's happening in the scene? Here, the task is a little more is given to them. They have to arrange these works in a particular sequence, but it's still serving the same function in their interaction. It's giving them something to answer and address through their interpretation. So as they reach this disagreement, they proceed through this fairly elaborate series of gestures. So you see she does the pose to strengthen her argument. She's screaming. And then the girl on the right does this sunset gesture, this metaphoric gesture of a sunset. And then they turn back to the text for support. And then at the end, they have elaborated their own perspective, which is good, but they haven't convinced each other, so they sort of resort to this territory dispute where they're wrestling with each other's zones. But I think this shows a different way where the technology has particular affordances that are maybe different from a sculpture or a painting, but are also just as physical in the way that they point and gesture and pose and create these interpretations. So if we look across these episodes, most generally, I think we can say that visitors use each other and resources and their surroundings to organize and structure their meaning making. So there are meaning potentials in the artworks. These aren't the only two people to approach the thinker and attempt to recreate the pose. So there's this idea that that thinking is being depicted and that exists as a meaning potential in the work. The texts and the resources, texts and labels become resources that visitors seek out and turn to negotiate either a question that they've asked themselves or that is given to them through an activity. And then gestures and other ways, other forms of embodied interaction also become really important. So we saw that the positioning of the visitors in relation to the work and to each other was really important. They would move to be able to fix their perspective, their visual orientation towards the work, to make sure that they were looking at the same thing as their partners or their friends. In some cases, or comparison became a really important sort of way for them to negotiate meaning, either by comparing two works or two adjacent images. But in the example with the thinker, there wasn't anything else really to compare. So the girl made her own pose and formed this new comparison in that sense. And then there are a lot of other subtle gestures, directing attention, posing, representing, navigating the screen, the multiple screens in the interactive room to draw all these other resources into play. So I think Palmyre is going to join me and help with some of the takeaways, some of the things that we can apply this, ways that we can apply this to practice in museums. So.
Yeah. In research on meaning making in museums, we've had for the last 10, 15 years an understanding of that, visitors to museums often are in groups with families or friends, and there's been an increased interest in talk and conversation for this reason, but very little of looking at how are physical interactions linked up to language, and how are they together creating a kind of perspective on meaning making that we can enrich our understandings of what we want from visitors when they're interpreting art or other kinds of cultural heritage. So it's just to kind of first highlight a new perspective that meaning making involves the body, language, and social interactions. That's one takeaway. The other is when thinking about designing opportunities for these kinds of interactions, is that it's not just every kind of artwork, of course, or maybe it is, I don't know, but to think through what kind of artworks. This is where I thought the talk about the music, the first talk was so interesting, and also in the last talk about identifying artworks that invite embodied interpretations or a richer kind of engagement. And also that since bodily engagement opens new interpretive spaces, and we're aware of that we can consider as all of new technologies are being introduced or considered being introduced into gallery spaces, to take that on board and to think about what kinds of use of the body and physical embodiment can play a role in thinking about the design of technologies. And also what an art museum and experience can be. Maybe that needs to change a bit too. I think that was it. I dropped off the slide here. I just want to make a short mention. Rolf's email isn't here. So that's rolf.steier at the same address, if you're interested in contacting Rolf. And I, on behalf as his supervisor, Rolf will be defending his thesis on December 12th at Helge Eng's house at Blindern. So and it's at 12:15. So if anybody is interested, it's open to the public. So I'm, on behalf of Rolf, inviting you there.
Thank you. Yes.
So, thank you.